The house was silent when I found them. My parents both collapsed, faces pale, unresponsive, lying in the living room as if the world had stopped around them. I froze, listening for any sound that might tell me this was just a nightmare. But there was none. Only the faint hum of the air conditioner, ticking like a clock counting down. Neighbors whispered later about an accident, but I knew, some instinct told me, that explanation didn't fit. And yet, when I tried to ask questions, I was met with polite smiles, subtle avoidance. Everyone I trusted seemed to know something I didn't, and I realized, even before the ambulance arrived, that I was already underestimated. I woke before sunrise, as I always did. The house smelled faintly of the night, coffee from yesterday, the lingering scent of old books stacked in the living room, and the faint trace of my mother's lavender perfume, even though she was still asleep. I moved quietly, careful not to wake anyone. Small routines mattered. I had always believed they anchored the day. The sound of the kettle clicking into place, the soft creak of the floorboards under my bare feet. It was a language I understood, one my parents never seemed to notice, but that comforted me nonetheless. My parents had always trusted me, or at least they pretended to. They left keys in my hand, errands to run, and tasks to manage. I was reliable in ways they could rely on without thinking twice. I carried that trust quietly, without comment, without assertion. It was a delicate kind of power, invisible, easily overlooked, easily dismissed, but entirely mine. I did not brag about it. I did not announce it. I simply used it, day after day, in small ways that mattered more than anyone could see. Breakfast was a quiet affair. My father read the paper, his eyes scanning words without noticing me moving around the kitchen. My mother hummed softly while preparing tea, never asking about my plans, never questioning my presence. It was a normal morning, ordinary in its ordinariness, and that was what made it safe. Safe enough that I could think without worry, observe without fear, and exist without challenge. After breakfast, I checked the mail and ran a few errands. The neighbors waved from across the street. I returned the gestures with measured nods. Life was predictable, structured, and for someone like me, that predictability was comforting. I knew the rhythm of this house, the rhythm of my town, and the rhythm of my parents' lives. I moved in alignment with all of it, quiet, unassuming, and unnoticed, except in moments that mattered, moments where I could act without interference, moments where the trust I carried became invisible leverage. At home, I organized the living room, arranging books and papers the way my father preferred without ever being asked. I noticed the smallest details, the way a pen was placed at an angle, the slight crease in a newspaper, the soft scuff on the carpet no one else acknowledged. I recorded these silently, mentally cataloging each one, aware that the world expected me to overlook these things, that the world would not recognize their significance. And perhaps that was the most useful form of power, the one hidden in plain sight. The quiet stretched into afternoon. I prepared lunch for my parents, knowing they would arrive from work at their usual times. I checked the doors, the windows, the locks, because I had learned early that small precautions mattered more than spoken words. In this household, the unseen was more reliable than the spoken. Trust here was implicit, but it was also fragile. I had learned not to test it openly. Instead, I maintained it in silence, a constant but invisible vigilance that kept the house, and my parents, safe in ways they did not notice. By late afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing receipts from errands I had run earlier. My mother entered quietly, carrying a basket of laundry. She smiled at me, a small, casual gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. My father followed, settling into his chair with a sigh. Their world seemed calm, ordered, unquestioning. I felt secure within it, even as a quiet awareness lingered in the back of my mind. That this trust, this perception of safety, was conditional, fleeting, and entirely dependent on my silent competence. Evening arrived. I prepared dinner, cleaned the counters, and lined up cups and plates for the three of us. The television played softly in the background, a low hum against the quiet conversations we sometimes had about mundane matters. The weather, errands, the minor troubles of neighbors. There was warmth here, but it was quiet warmth, measured and contained. I watched my parents interact, noticing the subtleties, the way my mother paused before speaking, the way my father's hands shook slightly when he lifted his cup. I cataloged these details silently, storing them away. They were fragments of the normal world, moments that seemed ordinary but would later serve as points of contrast, evidence of what I had once trusted and believed. As night fell, I prepared the bedrooms for sleep. I checked the locks again, adjusted the lighting, made certain that everything was in its place. I moved through the house with quiet assurance, carrying trust like a shield, careful to maintain the facade of normalcy. I was underestimated here, overlooked, dismissed, but in that underestimation lay a quiet dominion I understood fully, even if no one else did. In this ordinary world, I was present, observing, calculating, waiting. I did not yet know how fragile this world would prove to be. The first hint of unease came in small, almost imperceptible ways. I noticed my father's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter more often than before, but he would slide it out of view whenever I glanced in that direction. He claimed it was work, but the hurried way he silenced notifications felt off, deliberate. I said nothing, because speaking up here seemed unnecessary, almost intrusive. I had learned early that observation was more powerful than confrontation, that noticing quietly often revealed more than asking outright. My mother, too, began leaving rooms abruptly. She would pause mid-conversation, smile in that practiced way that didn't reach her eyes, and leave. When I later asked about it, she waved it off as a minor errand or a task that couldn't wait. The words sounded plausible, but the hesitancy in her tone, the flicker of something withheld in her expression, lingered in my mind. Something about the rhythm of the household had changed, though on the surface nothing had. At dinner, the smallest inconsistencies began to accumulate. My father would repeat the same story twice or omit details that he had always included. My mother would offer vague excuses for why she was late in returning a call or finishing a chore. I noticed it, but shrugged internally. People forget. People get distracted. That was the logic I applied to maintain calm, to reassure myself that nothing had truly shifted. But the quiet tension in the air was becoming harder to ignore, a subtle vibration beneath the daily routines I relied upon. I began to notice other people's behavior, too. Neighbors who had once greeted me warmly now offered cursory nods, smiles that didn't meet their eyes. Friends of my parents visited less often, or when they did, their conversations skirted around topics they once approached freely. I cataloged these changes silently, as though I were taking notes in a ledger that no one else could see. Their significance was unclear, but the pattern was emerging. Something was being concealed. I felt it in the pauses, in the slight stiffening of gestures, in the way questions were answered just a fraction too quickly. Even my own routines felt subtly off. I found letters slightly misplaced, or documents I knew I had organized differently now shuffled. My parents' schedules, which had always been reliable and predictable, began showing small gaps or overlaps I could not account for. I began double-checking locks, cupboards, even the alignment of picture frames on the walls. These were not actions born of paranoia. They were born of a quiet insistence that the world I understood should make sense. When it didn't, I noted it, storing the discomfort in the recesses of my mind, a quiet awareness that something was amiss. The tension, though subtle, became more pronounced during conversations. I asked neutral questions about their day, their work, and received answers that were curt, rehearsed, or oddly evasive. My father's laughter was slightly off, my mother's smile just a fraction too quick. I caught these things because I had always observed, because I had always measured. But the unease remained difficult to articulate, almost intangible. I could sense deception, but its form remained hidden. Sleep became restless. I would lie awake, tracing the day's small disturbances, replaying conversations and movements. Every glance, every hesitation, every skipped detail seemed to carry weight I could not yet name. My instinct, usually reliable, whispered warnings I could not fully comprehend. Yet I held back, refraining from questioning too directly, from confronting what might not exist. In this household, subtlety had always been a kind of armor, and I wore it instinctively. By midweek, the discomfort had grown into a quiet knot in my chest. The house felt slightly colder, the air slightly heavier. The routines I had once trusted, the way cups were placed, the order of tasks, the rhythm of meals, no longer provided the same reassurance. I moved through the rooms with a careful precision, noting small changes, listening for the invisible shifts. Every creak of the floorboards, every misplaced object, every muted response was a message I could not yet decode. I did not speak of these things. Not yet. I carried the awareness in silence, as I had always carried my quiet power, observing, measuring, holding space for truths that were not yet visible. And while I remained calm outwardly, internally I sensed the world around me bending ever so slightly, the foundation of my trust shifting under invisible pressure. The first threads of betrayal were weaving themselves into the fabric of our lives, delicate, almost undetectable, but they were there. It began with small inconsistencies I could no longer ignore. My father came home later than usual one evening, claiming a delayed meeting, yet his car's mileage suggested he had left far earlier than he admitted. I noted the discrepancy silently, my chest tightening in a way I had learned to recognize as the body's first warning of betrayal. I asked no questions aloud. I had discovered long ago that asking too soon only provoked evasions or anger. Observation was safer. Then there were the emails. I had access to our family computer for errands and budgeting, a task my parents trusted me with. A notification popped up one evening, a string of messages marked archived, the sender unfamiliar. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, resisting the impulse to investigate. Something in me warned that opening them might break a delicate balance. Still, the curiosity, the need to understand what did not fit was too strong. I clicked. The messages were mundane in appearance, yet a subtle tension ran through the words, a rhythm I had come to recognize as hidden subtext. Details I knew to be untrue, explanations that could not align with reality. My mother's behavior added to the unease. She began asking about my whereabouts in ways that were unnecessary, questions phrased as concern but weighted with something else, scrutiny, calculation. When I responded honestly, her nod was delayed, her smile faint, almost rehearsed. She carried herself differently now, a subtle tightness in her shoulders, a shadow beneath her eyes that hadn't been there before. I cataloged these nuances like evidence, each one a silent clue that the reality I relied upon was fracturing. The phone calls became another marker. Calls that should have been brief lingered in the background, voices overlapping, muffled. I could hear fragments, a sigh, a laugh, a hurried word that did not belong in the conversation I was supposed to be witnessing. It was enough. Enough to plant suspicion firmly in my mind. enough to seed questions that I could not yet voice. I recorded these moments mentally, letting them accumulate, building a quiet dossier of contradictions and half-truths. Neighbors began behaving oddly as well. One afternoon, while retrieving the mail, I noticed a woman from 2 houses down glance toward our driveway and immediately look away, pretending to be busy with her own property. A week later, a man I had seen walking his dog paused near our front yard, stared in my direction, then hurried on. I could not determine whether these were coincidences or warnings, but the pattern of avoidance of secrecy created an unmistakable tension in the environment I had once trusted implicitly. At home, I found evidence that could not be dismissed, a receipt for an expensive purchase neither parent had mentioned. A note in a notebook, written in my father's hand, but with words that suggested planning beyond ordinary errands. I traced the handwriting carefully, observing the subtle pressure, the rhythm. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that refused to present itself fully. I cataloged everything quietly, storing it in mental folders labeled with dates and context. In my experience, keeping the record was more powerful than confronting the unknown. It offered leverage when the truth finally emerged. Even small gestures began to feel rehearsed. My mother's smile at dinner, the one that had always signaled warmth, was now faint, almost mechanical. My father's laughter no longer matched the situation. I observed without comment, noting each divergence from the patterns I had relied upon. It was a careful, restrained kind of awareness, one that demanded patience and silence. To speak too soon would alert them, allow them to hide more effectively. At night, I lay awake, replaying the day's events. I reviewed each movement, each conversation, each subtle deviation from normal. I felt the familiar tension in my chest, the quiet ache in my stomach, and I allowed it to settle there. It was not fear, not yet, it was recognition. Recognition that the house I thought I knew, the routines I thought were stable, and the people I trusted were no longer entirely transparent. Something had shifted. Something had been hidden. By the end of the week, I had my first real understanding. Trust, once assumed, was fragile. The cracks were small, nearly invisible, but they ran deep. I realized with quiet clarity that my parents were not acting with the openness I had always relied upon. There was deception here, subtle, silent, and carefully constructed. And though I remained calm outwardly, inside, a silent ledger of suspicions had begun to take shape, each observation a line in a record that I intended to follow to its conclusion. By now, the unease had settled into the house like a persistent fog. I had begun to notice patterns that could not be ignored, yet when I tried to speak, my observations were met with subtle resistance, an almost imperceptible shift in tone, a dismissive shrug, a smile that did not reach the eyes. I began to realize that the very people I had trusted most were now capable of undermining my perception, quietly, carefully, without raising suspicion. It started with small accusations, almost casual. "You're imagining things," my father said one evening when I mentioned the misplaced bills. He did not raise his voice. The calmness in his tone made it feel like reason itself was on his side. "You must have forgotten where you put them." I nodded silently, feeling the familiar tension in my chest, a tight coil of frustration and awareness. The words were simple, mundane, but their effect was destabilizing. I began to question my own memory, even as I had mentally cataloged each detail. My mother followed in subtle ways. She questioned my errands, my observations, my choices with a softness that seemed meant to soothe, but carried an undercurrent of control. "Are you sure you remember correctly?" she would ask, tilting her head, her smile polite, almost conspiratorial. I had learned to trust my own careful observations, but the repetition of these moments, these quiet invalidations, created a slow erosion of certainty. Doubt crept in, not fully, but enough to disturb the stability I relied upon. Conversations became exercises in restraint. Any comment I made about unusual patterns was met with reasoned explanations that didn't align with reality, explanations designed to disarm me, to make me second-guess my instincts. The receipts, the notes, the subtle behavioral shifts, all dismissed with plausible rationales. It was a pattern I had seen before in minor betrayals of trust, the gaslighting that made one doubt what was evident, the calm dismissal that disguised manipulation as care. Even friends began to participate unconsciously. One neighbor, who had been a regular visitor, commented lightly on my overthinking, as if my observations were a personal flaw rather than an attempt to understand reality. Another hinted that perhaps I was too sensitive, that the household operated in ways I might not fully comprehend. I recognized the pattern immediately. When suspicion emerges, others are enlisted, subtly, to reinforce it. My parents didn't need to speak. They had created a network of quiet invalidation. At home, I noticed my parents were increasingly controlling the environment without drawing attention to it. Certain doors were locked without explanation. Notes that had once been accessible now disappeared. Items I had previously cataloged were moved, altered, or hidden. Every small action carried a dual purpose: maintain appearances and manipulate perception. They were not careless in their deception. Everything was calculated, disciplined, and designed to make me question my own awareness. I began to experience moments of self-doubt I had never known. I would check my records, retrace my steps, and still find myself questioning whether I had misremembered, whether my instincts were betraying me. The emotional strain was subtle but cumulative. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no confrontations. There was only the slow, insidious pressure of a reality that refused to acknowledge the truth I had quietly observed. Even as doubt crept in, I maintained my outward calm. I moved through the house with the same quiet precision I always had, tending to chores, preparing meals, and cataloging every detail. Observation became more than a habit. It became a shield. I recorded inconsistencies silently, my mental ledger growing heavier by the day. Each act of gaslighting, each dismissal, became a note of evidence rather than a reason to react. I did not lash out. I did not plead for acknowledgement. I waited. Sleep offered no escape. At night, I replayed conversations, reviewing each word, gesture, and hesitation. I could see the manipulations clearly, the subtle ways in which trust was being eroded and reality reshaped. I felt the psychological cost settling in my chest, a quiet ache, a tightening around my ribs, a low hum of tension that refused to dissipate. I could not confront them yet. To do so would alert them, tighten their control, and risk losing even the faint access I still had to the truth. And so I endured. Silently, carefully. With every act of dismissal and every gaslit comment, I cataloged, measured, and waited. I understood that power did not need to be loud to be devastating. It only needed to be hidden, disciplined, and enforced through subtle manipulation. The quiet dominance of the betrayers was precise, but it had revealed a truth I carried like a blade in the dark. I was underestimated, dismissed, and carefully monitored. And that miscalculation, though invisible to them, would be their undoing if I remained patient. The first undeniable evidence arrived unexpectedly. I had been going through a stack of old receipts while organizing the office. a task my parents assigned to me often, trusting me to handle mundane details without question. One receipt fell out of place, tucked behind another document, and I froze as I read it. It was from a pharmacy I did not recognize, time-stamped at a day and hour my parents had claimed to be elsewhere. At first, I thought it might be a mistake, a misprint, something explainable. But the details, the items purchased, the patterns of timing, did not align with any routine I knew. I did not speak immediately. I held the receipt in my hand, turning it over, examining it. My parents had always trusted me with minor financial records. I understood how to read them, how to find inconsistencies without triggering alarm. This time, the discrepancy was too large to ignore. I cataloged it carefully, noting date, time, and itemized charges in my mental ledger. I did not confront anyone. Observation was stronger than confrontation, and I had learned that patience revealed more than accusations ever could. The second piece of evidence came from a witness I hadn't anticipated, the neighbor's dog walker. While retrieving the mail one afternoon, I noticed him pausing at the edge of our driveway, eyes scanning the windows, posture tense. Something about his hesitation spoke of awareness he did not openly acknowledge. Later, I found him in the yard and asked a simple, neutral question about the weather, watching him carefully. He answered, but his gaze flickered toward our front door several times. The recognition in his eyes was fleeting, subtle, but unmistakable. He knew something. That awareness, quiet and unspoken, confirmed that the house I trusted was not as transparent as I had believed. I began noticing traces in other systems. Emails marked deleted reappeared in odd folders. Messages I had not sent were archived, and logs on the family computer reflected access at times my parents claimed they had been elsewhere. Each discovery was small, isolated, and plausible enough to be dismissed if presented singly. But taken together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The betrayal was real. I cataloged each instance with meticulous care: date, time, context, and potential significance. My mental ledger expanded, a quiet archive of contradictions waiting for the moment the truth could be assembled fully. At dinner, I observed my parents' reactions to each other with renewed scrutiny. My mother laughed at a comment my father made, but the laughter did not reach her eyes. My father's gestures were precise, careful, almost rehearsed. I cataloged these as well: subtle signs, micro-expressions, silences that stretched longer than necessary. I did not speak. I simply observed, noting that even within their ordinary interactions, cracks of deception were beginning to show. Even small objects became clues. A misplaced book, a hidden note in a drawer, an envelope slightly ajar, all hinted at movement and concealment. I began paying closer attention to details I had once taken for granted: the angle of frames on the wall, the faint scuff on the carpet, the position of keys on the counter. Each anomaly was recorded in silence, part of a growing archive that painted a picture I could not yet fully articulate aloud. I noticed another shift. My parents' behavior toward me had subtly changed. My father began asking more pointed questions about my errands, my mother hovering slightly when I handled paperwork. Their concern felt calculated, as if they were testing whether I had discovered something. I cataloged these interactions too, marking tone, timing, and phrasing. I could sense the invisible boundary closing in, the net of control tightening, but I remained calm. Restraint was necessary. Revealing awareness too soon would provoke concealment or deflection. One afternoon, while checking the family computer for budgeting purposes, I discovered a folder marked innocuously with a single letter. The files inside were mundane at first glance: spreadsheets, scanned receipts, but among them were documents and images I had no prior knowledge of, evidence of planning and deception. I traced timestamps, cross-referenced access logs, and noted discrepancies. I recognized the quiet orchestration of a betrayal that had been underway long before I had suspected. The realization settled in slowly, almost like a physical weight. This was not an accident or a minor lapse of trust. This was deliberate, sustained, and carefully hidden. And yet, even with this evidence, confrontation was impossible. I did not want acknowledgement from them. I wanted the truth to emerge naturally, fully, and indisputably. I kept quiet, cataloging every detail, every witness, every trace left behind. By the end of the week, I had compiled enough partial exposure to know the shape of the deception, though the full extent remained obscured. The house, once a space of predictability and trust, now felt like a theater where I had been observing a script I was only beginning to understand. My ledger, silent, unspoken, meticulously detailed, was my only shield and my only weapon. The betrayal was real, and for the first time I felt a quiet, simmering certainty that the truth, though partially hidden, would soon demand acknowledgement. The shift was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, but by midweek, the tension had become palpable. Every movement within the house carried weight. Every word, even casual conversation, felt layered with unspoken intention. I noticed my father lingering over documents he previously would have left untouched, his posture stiff, hands fidgeting with pens as if rehearsing explanations he would never speak aloud. My mother's gestures had grown deliberate, precise, as if each movement was calibrated to test my awareness without revealing her own. I began to see patterns of avoidance everywhere. Doors that had once been open remained closed. Notes I had relied on for months disappeared from their usual places, only to reappear subtly altered. The house had become a theater of concealment, each act performed with careful restraint. I cataloged everything, as always, recording date, time, context, and potential significance in my mental ledger. By now, it was more than observation. It was strategy. Every move I made was calculated to preserve access to the truth while remaining unseen. My father confronted me first, though subtly. One evening, while I was reviewing household accounts, he leaned against the doorframe and asked, "Are you sure you understand how this works? It's complicated and mistakes can happen." His tone was calm, almost instructional, but the underlying message was clear. He was testing me, measuring how much I knew. I nodded silently, offering no response, no acknowledgement of suspicion. The restraint in my posture, the calm neutrality of my voice, became a quiet counterbalance to his probing. I realized then that this escalation was intentional. They were reacting because they sensed I was aware, even if I had not yet confronted them directly. My mother's methods were quieter but equally deliberate. She began inserting herself into tasks I had always managed independently, asking questions that seemed casual but were layered with implication. "Did you check this report thoroughly?" she asked, placing her hand on a folder I had already reviewed multiple times. The gesture was light, almost imperceptible, yet the intention was clear. She wanted to unsettle me, to make me doubt my own competence, while maintaining the appearance of concern. I continued silently, cataloging each interaction with meticulous care, recording the psychological landscape that was forming around me. I noticed changes in the external environment as well. Neighbors who had previously been friendly now offered only curt greetings, lingering too long in glances that carried subtle warnings. A mail carrier paused briefly at the gate, scanning the windows before continuing, as though aware of unspoken tensions within the house. These small signals reinforced what I had begun to suspect. The world I had trusted was no longer neutral. Everyone I interacted with seemed to be participating in a quiet choreography that I was only beginning to decode. The stakes rose further when I discovered new evidence in the systems I had long monitored. Files I had assumed were private had been accessed, altered, or removed. Receipts, emails, and notes that had previously been innocuous now revealed subtle inconsistencies pointing to a broader pattern of deception. I recorded every instance silently, tracing timestamps, cross-referencing access logs, and noting discrepancies. The betrayal was no longer partial. It had become an intricate, sustained operation, hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, I observed a conversation between my parents that confirmed the pattern I had feared. From my position just outside the kitchen doorway, I overheard snippets. Words like timing, unnoticed, and control floated above the mundane hum of household activity. Their voices were low, almost conversational, but the subtext was unmistakable. They were orchestrating, coordinating, manipulating. And I was the observer, quietly recording, quietly understanding, quietly waiting. The psychological pressure intensified. I began to feel the weight of awareness acutely, the tension coiling in my chest, the ache behind my eyes. I slept less, moved more deliberately, spoke only when necessary. The restraint I had practiced for months became essential to my survival within the household. Any misstep could provoke concealment or, worse, confrontation. The equilibrium I had maintained, the quiet, invisible power of observation, was under threat, and I had to protect it carefully. And yet, amid the tension, I recognized a subtle advantage. Their reactions, tests, probing, evasion, revealed patterns, weaknesses, and priorities I could exploit silently. I did not speak. I did not act, I did not confront. Instead, I watched, listened, and catalogued, letting every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen word serve as evidence in the ledger I had maintained since the first hint of unease. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the house had become taut, like a string pulled to its limit. My parents' behavior was more calculated, more deliberate, and more revealing. They were reacting to my presence, to my observation, without realizing that I had anticipated every move. The quiet dominance they had exercised for months was beginning to show cracks under the weight of their own caution. In the stillness of my room, I traced the patterns of the past weeks, aligning evidence, cross-referencing conversations, reconstructing timelines. Every small interaction, every concealed gesture, every silent avoidance formed a map of betrayal. And in that quiet mapping, I understood the magnitude of what I faced. A household built on trust now dominated by deception, where every familiar routine had become a trap, and every interaction carried hidden consequences. I was underestimated, dismissed, and surveilled. But quietly, I was preparing to witness the full scope of their actions. By now, the weight of what I had uncovered pressed against me like a living thing. I moved through the house with measured steps, aware of every sound, every shift in light, every subtle gesture my parents made. Their deception was no longer a shadow. It had become tangible, a constant presence that followed me from room to room. I catalogued, I recorded, I observed. But the strain of knowing, of living within a carefully constructed lie, began to erode something deeper than patience. The breaking point came not with confrontation, nor with anger, but with quiet realization. I had arranged the documents I had found, the receipts, the messages, the hidden folders into a timeline. Each detail, each discrepancy, each subtle movement I had noticed for months now formed an undeniable pattern. My parents had manipulated, concealed, and deceived in ways I had once thought impossible. I felt the truth settle in my chest like a cold weight, a gravity that could not be lifted. It was in a moment as ordinary as any other that the magnitude struck me. I was in the kitchen, wiping a counter I had cleaned dozens of times, when my mother's laughter floated from the living room, slightly off pitch, slightly forced. My father's voice answered, casual but layered with the subtle tension of someone careful not to reveal too much. I froze mid-motion, listening to the cadence, the pauses, the words left unspoken. The betrayal was complete, yet still hidden behind the polite facade they maintained for the world. I wanted to speak. I wanted to demand explanations, to tear through the layers of deception that had suffocated the house for weeks. But a quieter voice within me whispered restraint. Reaction now would only tighten the web, alert them to the clarity I had gained. I realized that power here was not in confrontation. It was in silence, in observation, in the careful accumulation of undeniable truth. To act prematurely would be to surrender the advantage I had painstakingly cultivated. The psychological cost became visible in my own body. Nights grew restless. My chest ached with tension. My hands trembled slightly when I tried to maintain routine. I caught myself pausing before speaking, even in the smallest interactions, recalculating what could be said and what would alert them. The emotional labor of knowing without revealing, of witnessing without acting, became exhausting. And yet, within that exhaustion, I discovered clarity. I had been underestimated from the beginning, dismissed for my quiet nature, but the ledger I maintained, every observation, every trace, every silent record, was now more precise than their attempts at concealment. I watched them carefully, noting patterns in their behavior, minor adjustments in routine, and inconsistencies in their explanations. My mother would avoid my gaze when handing me tasks. My father's fingers would fidget over the edge of a desk, betraying the calm surface he tried to maintain. Each moment of restraint, each carefully measured smile, each attempt at normalcy only reinforced the truth I had already recognized. The betrayal was deliberate, sustained, and meticulously hidden, but it had cracks. There was a quiet moment one evening that crystallized the moral cost. I was arranging papers on the kitchen table when I noticed a folder partially visible in a drawer my parents thought I had not checked. The edge of the paper protruded, marked with handwriting I recognized but had not previously seen in context. I opened it discreetly. The contents revealed plans and communications that confirmed the breadth of the deception, including interactions with people I had not known were involved. For a moment, I felt a surge of anger, of disbelief, but I contained it. Restraint was my choice. The breaking point was less about emotion and more about principle. I understood fully that retaliation would not restore trust, would not undo the manipulation, and would not reclaim the normalcy that had been stolen. Instead, I chose a quieter path, meticulous observation, careful documentation, and a readiness to let consequences emerge naturally. My parents had underestimated me, believing that silence equated to ignorance. But my silence was deliberate, a shield and a record. I was no longer naive. I was watchful, restrained, and morally resolute. By the end of the week, I had accepted the full cost of knowing. The household would never return to its previous state of trust. I had witnessed betrayal unfold layer by layer, and I had endured the psychological weight in quiet observation. There was no dramatic confrontation, no explosive revelation. The breaking point was internal, a recalibration of my understanding of the people I trusted most and the world I had thought was safe. I had reached a place of quiet certainty. The truth was undeniable, and I would bear its weight without spectacle. In the stillness of my room, I reviewed my ledger one last time for the night. Every detail, every witness, every hidden trace of manipulation had been accounted for. I felt the familiar ache in my chest, a mixture of grief, fatigue, and clarity. I understood now that power was not in action or speech. It was in observation, in records, in restraint. And I would carry that truth forward, silently, as the household's delicate equilibrium began to fracture under the weight of its own concealment. The moment of reckoning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. No doors slammed, no voices raised. The first visible consequence of their concealment appeared in the form of a misfiled document, one that had escaped my meticulous attention until now. My father, who had carefully orchestrated routines to hide his actions, suddenly faced an anomaly within the system he had trusted would remain perfect. He noticed it before I intervened, and the brief furrow in his brow was enough to signal the start of the unraveling. It was subtle at first. A conversation with a neighbor revealed hints of discrepancies I had suspected, but had no proof of. The neighbor mentioned a detail about a visit from my parents that contradicted their story, a seemingly minor point that carried undeniable weight when cross-referenced with my records. I observed silently, noting the effect it had on my father. His calm composure flickered, a small tremor in the otherwise deliberate facade. The first cracks were visible, small but unmistakable. Then, the documents I had quietly compiled began to gain relevance beyond my own observation. A bank statement, a service record, and an email trail, each piece individually plausible, together painted a picture my parents could no longer deny. I placed these records in order, aligning dates, times, and actions. When my father finally confronted a discrepancy, it was not met with denial because the evidence was undeniable. His usual calm authority faltered, and in that silence the truth took form. My mother, too, felt the weight of exposure. The careful gestures she had perfected, smiles, nods, casual questions, began to unravel under scrutiny. A misplaced note, an inconsistent timestamp, an interaction witnessed by someone she had assumed would never notice. It all coalesced into undeniable proof. She paused mid-action more than once, her habitual composure strained as the reality of the situation sank in. I watched quietly, cataloging every reaction, every attempt at control, every flicker of panic that betrayed their careful construction. I did not intervene directly. My power remained in observation, in the ledger I had maintained meticulously since the first signs of deception. Every record, every witness, every small inconsistency I had noted was now forming an unassailable case. And as I watched my parents navigate the subtle but undeniable exposure of their actions, I understood the depth of the quiet consequence I had orchestrated merely by waiting. The truth, once partially hidden, had begun to assert itself with a force they could not control. Other people began to notice as well. Neighbors, friends, and distant relatives, previously unwitting participants in the facade, started to align their perceptions with reality. A casual remark here, a pointed observation there, and the quiet network that had reinforced their concealment began to shift. I observed their reactions with calm detachment, noting how authority can crumble not through confrontation, but through the slow, patient accumulation of evidence. My parents were not humiliated by spectacle. They were confronted with reality in its most restrained and devastating form. Even as consequences unfolded, the psychological cost remained high. I felt a constant tension in my chest, a weight of awareness and responsibility. The exposure of betrayal did not erase the months of manipulation, nor did it restore the trust that had been eroded. I remained restrained, careful not to gloat, careful not to allow satisfaction to disturb the gravity of the situation. The ledger I had maintained was not a tool for revenge. It was a record of truth, and truth in itself carried consequence. By midweek, the subtle unraveling had become undeniable. My parents' behavior changed once again, this time not out of strategy but necessity. Their routines shifted, gestures of concealment weakened, explanations became defensive and halting. Even their interactions with the world outside the house began to reflect a cautious recalibration. Authority, carefully exercised for months, had lost its quiet dominion. And yet, the resolution was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic collapse, only the quiet, steady emergence of truth that reshaped the balance in ways they could no longer manipulate. The final consequence, the one that truly marked the shift, was internal. My parents were forced to acknowledge, at least tacitly, that their actions had been visible, documented, and understood. Their carefully maintained authority, their silent manipulations, had been rendered ineffective by the quiet power of observation and patience. And while no apology was offered, and no acknowledgement of their wrongdoing spoken aloud, the weight of reality had settled upon them. I did not celebrate. I did not demand recognition. I continued my routines, maintaining calm, continuing observation, cataloging the final pieces of evidence that would ensure clarity remained even as the immediate crisis subsided. The house was quieter now, the tension diffused but present, a lasting reminder that deception has limits, and that even invisible authority can collapse under the pressure of documented truth. The house was calm, but it felt different. The subtle tension that had woven itself through every corner had shifted, leaving behind a quiet residue. My parents moved through the rooms with the practiced precision of people who had lost the comfort of unquestioned authority. Their gestures were measured, words cautious, as if each action carried the invisible weight of scrutiny. I watched without interruption, cataloging, observing, noting the lingering shadows of deception that would not be erased. Life resumed its routines, but the rhythm was altered. Breakfasts were quieter, conversations lighter, but the subtle cracks remained. The ledger in my mind, the meticulous record of observations, hidden traces, and small inconsistencies, was complete. I did not speak of it, did not confront, and did not claim victory. The truth had asserted itself without spectacle, and that quiet, restrained revelation carried its own power. I moved through the house as I always had, silently performing the tasks that anchored the day. The ordinary became a landscape of reflection, a misplaced cup, a folded newspaper, the faint scent of lavender in the air. Each detail was a reminder of what had passed, of the months of subtle deception, of the psychological cost I had endured. The house was mine to navigate quietly, but it bore the scars of betrayal that no conversation could fully erase. And yet there was peace in the silence. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a measured clarity that only comes when the truth has been seen and preserved. My parents' control had diminished, their manipulations exposed, but the world remained steady outside the walls. The lessons of observation, patience, and restraint had endured, as had the quiet dominion of knowledge that I carried, unspoken, invisible, undeniable. In that quiet ending, there was no celebration, no vindication, no declaration. Only the aftermath of truth, heavy and unyielding, and the slow, careful resumption of life under the weight of what had been revealed.